Good afternoon, everyone. I expect today might be a light meeting given that it's VMworld this week, but I'm working from home, so didn't feel like canceling the call for anyone who else wanted to join. This is the biweekly cluster API provider for vSphere, syncup, and this call is recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube, so please be on your best behavior. I don't think we should have to say that. The ground rule is just don't be a jerk, and we'll all get along. All right, let me go ahead and share my Safari. Got some notes up here. So today's agenda. If you want to add yourself to the agenda, great. If not, then yeah, it's your prerogative. I'll go ahead and let me go ahead and go to chat and paste the agenda in chat. I tend to wait until the meeting's going since chat doesn't have scroll back for those who join late. All right, so what are the updates? Well, over the weekend, we updated to V1 Alpha 2 on the master branch. It's actually a pretty big deal. What does it mean? Well, realistically, what it means is the master branch is broken for the time being. And that might seem like, well, why would you do that? Well, V1 Alpha 2 is a really big deal for the progression and future of Cluster API. And not even all of the core Cluster API components are V1 Alpha 2 ready. But due to the velocity at which Cluster API is moving, we need to be in line and in sync with the other providers like Cluster API for AWS or Kappa, so that we don't get left behind in design discussions and implementation. And so, yes, the ETE tests are disabled on master because they would fail. And for the sake of people coming to master, we have a big note up at the top. Hey, the project's master branch has been updated and it's not stable. Please use this branch for the stable V1 Alpha 1 release. Because I was pinged 4 times on Sunday by people I've never heard of before asking me about the branch. I said, is master not working? I said, who are you? Wow, are you using this? And so, yeah, you saw the release branch there. I will cover that later. So what are the outstanding items for V1 Alpha 2? Well, the first one is to get end-to-end working on master. Cluster Cuddle is not working yet in V1 Alpha 2, to my knowledge. They have not yet decided how to do the pivot. There are changes to the way V1 Alpha 2 works. All infrastructure providers now share the same. All infrastructure providers that are sponsored by a Kubernetes SIG share the same API group. So one solution they've considered is pivoting all resources that belong to that API group. Another one is just to walk the resource graph. They don't know yet. That's the big blocker. The other blocker is there's no official kubeADM bootstrapper image yet. I did find one to use for some light testing, but it's changing every day. So let me actually make some notes here. Cluster Cuddle, kubeADM, bootstrapper image. I'll update these later. But there is a way to do non-Cluster Cuddle based testing. Andrew Sykem and I did that when we were first working with CatV. You could deploy a cluster with kind and then just deploy components manually to that. So I did that in a few places, and it still isn't going to work because there is a big outstanding PR or their issue number 510 that we'll talk about in a second. Yuvraj, a colleague at VMware, is working on that. So yeah, the big deal is the getting EDE working on. What did I do wrong here? Getting EDE working on master, and so that's being blocked by the things we just talked about, and then this issue. So there is this new virtual machine service for anyone familiar with Cluster API at all. Used to, we would interact with govmami directly. That's govmami package. We now have this new service called virtual machine service that is reconcile VM and destroy VM. It uses these middleware types that you can go look at yourself, or I'll bring up here while I'm talking. And what's the point of all of this? It's to abstract the workflow of resource creation, or rather virtual machine workflow creation, from the actual current implementation of v1 alpha 1, which would just go vMommy, so that in the future versions of CapV, if there are other ways to manage the virtual machine lifecycle, those routes could be leveraged as opposed to the means we're currently achieving that with, or with which we're currently achieving that. And so again, Yuvraj, a colleague, is implementing the way we did this previously with this new service, and he's going to open a PR today or tomorrow. So the other thing that we did not address in the update, I did update the getting started guide. I realized I'd need to update the, let's see, somebody's taking notes, I'll do this. So v1 migration path, to do update troubleshooting guide. We need to update the troubleshooting guide. One of the reasons I didn't do that is because I didn't have the examples, because we don't have a fully functioning version of v1 alpha 2 yet. But there's the v1 alpha 1 migration path. So I actually ripped the v1 a1 types out because I was following Kappa. Although they left them, they also don't have a migration path implemented, and it wasn't clear to me if that's something we're attempting to do. So here's where they used to be. So if we need a migration path from v1 alpha 1, we need to reintroduce those types. Doing so wouldn't be a huge deal. I did think of opening a PR for that. There were some issues with the dependencies, with rebuilding vendor, with some conflicting dependencies, which is why I haven't opened a PR for that. I have to figure that out. And then again, on a to-do, we need to update the troubleshooting guide. But the getting started guide is updated for v1 alpha 2. There is a large tracking issue right here that indicates all of the issues that we need to do for v1 alpha 2 or have been done. You can take a look. Some of these are in review. I've checked them if they're in review, and some of them are complete. Thanks, Andrew, for taking notes. The one more thing about v1 alpha 2 that's kind of different, since there's not it's not a big call, I'll go ahead and review this with people, even though at least 2 of you have worked with it, and so this will be helpful for you to know this. So in v1 alpha 2, we have these things called templates. Machine deployments use templates. So what's a template? The control plane machines don't, but the machine deployments do, much like the old machine set. So what's a template? vSphere machine template. A template is pretty straightforward. It doesn't necessarily relate directly back to a virtual machine template like you would think of in vSphere, right? Instead, it's supposed to be an immutable resource in Kubernetes that represents a template from which you create machines. And so for AWS, that might be an instance type. Now, in vSphere, though, because we do have templates from which we clone VMs, these could still behave and act the same as AWS instances, or instance types, rather, and fall in line with templates. So think about this. We have a template from which we clone machines, a vSphere template. A Kubernetes vSphere machine template resource would look like this. Let's say it references this vSphere template. We might have 3 or 4 vSphere machine template resources, all based on this vSphere template, but that have a different number of CPUs, different amount of memory, different disk size. So we might have the version of a large implementation of the Kubernetes 1.15.3 CentOS image, a medium version of that, a small version of that. So when we're doing deployments using v1 alpha 2 for the worker nodes, we don't define the machines directly. We instead reference these templates. And again, they're supposed to be immutable. And what that means is, and Andrew, I asked you to look into these via chance. I don't know if you had. This is just all, I spent 10 minutes looking into this ahead of today's call, so I could hopefully speak to it and not sound like a complete idiot. But I remember hearing someone saying that they're supposed to be immutable. And so what this means is that if you need to, say you've got an existing cluster you've deployed. And they're all based on the medium version of this template. Updating the medium version of that template to have 4 CPUs instead of 2 doesn't mean that all those machines are going to now have 4 CPUs. You shouldn't change that template. You should just deploy it. You should create a new template, deploy new machines, and destroy the old machines. Deploy the new machines from the new template. And it's because most providers don't have the capacity to go in and, or at least currently CAPI doesn't have the capacity to go in and make those runtime changes based on the template, because you may not want all the old machines to reflect that change. So yeah, that's a big change to the way that the manifests are represented. The other big change is that instead of machines, we've got control plane.yaml, but other than that, it's basically the same. And so where we used to have 2 resources, a cluster and machine, now we've got a cluster machine, a vSphere cluster, and a vSphere machine, and then we also have this kubeadm config. And we're going to have a kubeadm config instance for every one of our machines. So, or at least the control plane machines. And anyway, the manifest stuff works. You can generate manifests right now. It's I've updated all the images, updated the release process. Yuvraj got the README updates in, so our README is all nice and updated with the new information, as well as all of our images. Anyway, we're in good shape for V1 Alpha 2, in so much as the doesn't work, but that's just standard par for the course with the other providers. Oh, one last thing. This is an artifact of KubeBuilder v2. For whatever reason, they made the unilateral decision that we're no longer nesting all source code under package. So you'll notice that we've got controllers at the root. We've got V1 API at the root. It's I don't know if there's a bigger discussion about that, but that's the way that is. If no more actuators, instead we have these controllers. So you can go in and take a look at that if you're interested. Yep. Okay, so V1 Alpha 1. What does this mean for V1 Alpha 1? Well, we are still maintaining a V1 Alpha 1 release. In fact, we are currently in the middle of a beta release. It's V42 beta 0. We're going to try to get either another beta or the release out the door this week. It probably should have happened last week, but we just didn't have the resources to do additional testing on this. And so instead of taking this directly to release, I know Andrew wanted to do some additional testing, and he was on PTO, so I wanted to give him the opportunity to do that, because quite frankly, I don't know there are too many people clamoring for this yet, so it can sit out here at beta. It does have some interesting changes that we will merge back into master, but there are a bunch of these changes that simply won't be part of CapV anymore, because they'll be moving to the Bootstrap provider. There is a release branch for this. So this release is happening, did I leave that up? Yes. So this release is happening on this branch, release-0.4. This will be the last branch based on V1 Alpha 1. So we can and probably will do additional V1 Alpha 1 based releases. There'll be 0.42, 0.43, 4.4, etc. But any minor release past 4, so 0.5, 0.6, whatever, those will be based on master, and so V1 Alpha 2. So again, this will be the last V1 Alpha 1 branch. I already went over new machine images are available. Thank you, Jim, for calling attention to that. I don't think Yassine is on, but I think Moshe might be at VMworld. I left opportunity for a load balancer update. I can give it for Yassine. He and I talked about this morning, in case he wasn't able to make it. So we are adding support for VMC and AWS. Again, I don't want to rehash all of this, but it's vanilla vSphere running in an AWS gauge. He's refactoring this for V1 Alpha 2. And what we agreed on this morning, and I actually spoke to Moshe about this as well briefly, was that because now we have the ability to write our own controllers, there was perhaps an eagerness on my part, not Yassine's, he made the smart decision, to, let's say, go ahead and implement Moshe's kept or a version of it inside of our manager. But what Yassine and I did agree on, let's get a working version of Yassine's PR in place so we can do HA testing with CapV. And then what Moshe and Yassine and I agreed on this morning was that then in tree to CapV, we'll look at implementing Moshe's kept as this load balancer controller reconciler with these new resources to be able to POC that to people in the Kubernetes community. Not necessarily merge it to master, but just it will give Moshe the ability to say, like, this is part of an existing project, as opposed to looking like he's prescribing a way of doing things. And that also makes Moshe happy with respect to embedding the project with VMC support, because the goal is eventually it will simply be the first implementation of the load balancer kept. So Yassine is working on that, and he thinks she should be able to get to that this week. Finally, the only other issue I could think of was the EDE framework updates. Andrew, I wasn't even sure if you were going to be able to make it, but I know you were out last week, so I don't know that you'll have any updates, but if you do.
I don't. I think the only thing I'd want to discuss is like how much we want to, like if we want EDs like straight on V1 Alpha 2, or if we want it working on both, because the way the EDEs are written is that it does have a test table with the fixtures for the CRDs, like vSphere, the vSphere provider spec. So like if we're going to templates and whatever, should I wait to work on this when V1 Alpha 2 is working, or?
I would wait, although you have an opportunity here. Like, it's not overly difficult to stand up a cluster without cluster cuddle. Cluster cuddle really just handles the pivot. I think there's an opportunity that if you wanted to work on this by, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Like you could take I don't know if it would be possible to do this actually, because it would be no, what I'm thinking would be basically tantamount to you doing the work that cluster cuddle would do, because ultimately it would still require, it would still I basically was thinking that you could just bypass cluster cuddle and start working on the V1A2 E2E framework, and it would start by basically using kind, but then things still have to be pivoted. Although I guess they don't necessarily have to be pivoted, right? Like you could use the E2E framework to stand up a cluster, even using V1A1 to stand up a cluster and don't pivot it, and then just deploy the components on that cluster. I'm just wondering if we want to use this framework as a way to start trying to test some of this stuff in an automated fashion until cluster cuddle is ready, or if you think that'll be too much work. Like basically automate the process of standing up the bootstrap cluster, using that to deploy the management cluster. There'd be no pivot, so then you'd have to deploy the components to the management cluster, because it would basically just be an empty cluster at that point. Does that make sense? It would basically be cluster cuddle without the pivot, and then you just deploy the components twice.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns there. Just kind of going off what the standard way of doing things are. So I personally wouldn't mind holding this work off until V1 Alpha 2 is more stable, and I can start taking some of the V1 Alpha 2 work right now. Because I need to catch up on I'm a bit behind on V1 Alpha 2 stuff, so that might make more sense.
Yeah, that sounds good. And honestly, where I'm going to go as soon as I get some of these issues created, I'm going to start trying to address more of the CAPI issues, like go see what help they need with cluster cuddle or anything else, because at this point, aside from the machine controller, where we are largely blocked is beyond our control. It's with CAPI. There are, and again, this issue, where's 472? This issue highlights those. So CAPI support creation of kubeconfig secret. This is much more important than is necessarily evident. Priority critical urgent. Vince is working on it. Basically, CAPI is responsible for or it used to be in the Kube ADM bootstrapper, the creation of the kubeconfig secret, but that was predicated on knowing the control plane endpoint in advance. So a lot of their logic was predicated on that. So this does track all of those outstanding issues. And see, we've got 30 minutes. If I'm going to ask Jeremy and Jim if they have any outstanding questions. Otherwise, Andrew, since it's the time you thought you would be in a call anyway, I was just going to kind of review the V182 workflow at a high level, so to catch you up.
I'm good. You can go on and cover whatever you want. I'll just follow along. I don't have any questions.
I'm the same as well. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jeremy. All right, so let's look at the. Is there a way to say close tabs? No, let's do close other tabs. That closes my notes. That's all right. We didn't have any more notes. So again, we've got the vSphere cluster object, which is just now the spec and status. So if you remember the old way of doing things, you would have the CAPI cluster and CAPI machine, and there would be this provider spec and provider status. Now we've actually got our own CRDs, and the provider spec for our clusters now our cluster spec, and there's the cluster status. Same with machines. Same deal. And then templates we've kind of gone over. A template ultimately just points to this template resource, and if you go in and dig into what that is, it's literally just where is it? It's up here. It's literally just the machine spec, so same thing. Okay, so controllers. Cluster controller is going to look very similar to the way our actuator used to work. This is all boilerplate code. I guess there is some interesting stuff here. So we fetch our vSphere machine instance, and from that we get the CAPI machine. Wait, is this the machine reconciler? Yeah, this is the machine controller. Sorry. Same logic though. We fetch the vSphere cluster instance, and from that we get the owner cluster, which is the CAPI cluster, and we create the context like we used to do in the actuator. One of the big changes, and this is something Yuvraj is on which he's working, all requeue logic is going to be handled in the controller. Anything beyond that, we're creating an issue for a new errors package. So either things will be retried because of exponential backoff, or we will decide on requeue in the controller and in the controllers, so that any Kubernetes specific logic is handled in the Kubernetes controllers. And that also ensures that we understand our error workflow more clearly as well, because right now in V1 Alpha 1, the requeue can happen at any level of the stack trace, and I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. It's my fault, but this is an opportunity to sort of refactor some of that. Same sort of logic here. We defer a patch. This is all just copied from Kappa. The cluster logic is largely the same. We either do a delete or a normal reconciliation. Right now, a cluster delete is just removing the finalizer. It doesn't have any other associated resources. Reconcile normal, this will be changing, well, it'll actually be changing later. So right now, it's going to be the way it is. If we don't have a finalizer, add it. So reconcile API endpoints. This is the first sort of function we have that does a reconciliation. If it already has an API endpoint, we exit. Otherwise, it gets the oldest control plane machine and records its IP address as the cluster API endpoint. Right now, it's hard-coded to use a bind port of 6443. In V1 Alpha 1, that was very configurable, but I have not written the code to go pull the kubeadm config because it's not a cluster level resource, it's a machine level, so I have to write that code. So right now it just assumes 6443, which is fine because the kubeadm config will assume the same. So this is where it gets interesting, right? Because this API endpoint is needed by the cluster API components to create the kube config for the target cluster and to finish update the control plane endpoint for the kubeadm config. So the way the logic works is we've got our message loop running, reconciles API endpoints. If it has one, great. If not, it gets the oldest IP in the cluster. It then records it here. vSphere cluster status API endpoints. There is something in cluster API v1 alpha 2 called an unstructured reader. So what they do when they're reconciling infrastructure, they look at our provider resource, and then they take the status and they unmarshal it into just a map. And so if you have a status API endpoints, which we do, it will actually take that and then unmarshal it into the CAPI cluster status API endpoints, which is then read by the CAPI cluster controller or the kubeconfig controller, wherever they're generating that kubeconfig, and it'll get updated as the control plane endpoint. So this should be all we have to do here. So we have reconcile API endpoints. The next thing that happens is we detect if there are any listed. If not, it's an error. Notice that we're not requeuing. If you don't requeue and just return an error, the behavior is to enter into an exponential backoff for that resource. It still will be requeued. It'll just back off exponentially up to sync time. So it's fine. We can re-examine requeues later. And then there's the cloud config secret. And again, if you knew the way it used to work, it was a little tighter loop. Now though, because this relies on that kubeconfig secret to exist, that's what this will do. Once the API endpoints get set here, we have to wait for the CAPI component to notice it, create the kubeconfig for the target cluster, and at which point we will be able to access the target cluster and inject it with our cloud config secret. So basically the same logic as that it used to be. It's if not the same, very similar. It's just that the place where the kubeconfig secret gets created is no longer handled by our machine actuator. It's handled by CAPI. So any questions about the cluster reconciliation logic?
Not yet.
Okay, I'm sure there will be later. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the machine reconciler, controller, whatever, same deal, right? We get the vSphere machine and we get the CAPI owner machine, and then we get as well as the CAPI cluster, so we can create the contexts. And then we just go down here, create the cluster context, the machine context, and then handle delete or handle normal. So this is actually kind of nice because before machines were handled in a CRUD model, create, update, delete, read is kind of like update in this case, but now they're handled in a just straight reconcile model. So if you have seen the diagram that I'd created, I don't know, a couple months ago for the reconciliation workflow, I actually approached this from just a straight reconciliation model. I didn't use the CRUD model. So now our reconciliation workflow actually is this. Because we no longer have the CRUD model. So it's either going to be delete or reconcile. There is nothing in between. So when we do a reconcile delete, we just get the virtual machine service and we call destroy VM, and we will requeue until the virtual machine state is not found. Reconcile normal, same deal. There's with some exceptions, checks to see if the machine's in error, if infrastructure is ready. Infrastructure could include things like the load balancer, the bootstrap data. So again, in v1 alpha 2, we're not initializing our bootstrap data, the cloud init user data. That's handled by this new kubeadm bootstrap controller. So obviously we can't do anything until that's available. Right now, the virtual machine service is just a placeholder. And you can see here it's going, I just load the go vmami service to ensure it's compiling correctly. But again, that's what Yuvraj is working on. And so reconcile normal, it just calls this reconcile VM function. And if you look into that, the work that Yuvraj is doing, it looks almost exactly like this. And then it checks, I think we're changing this to virtual machine state ready instead of running, but it'll basically requeue until the VM is ready. And again, This is because, like in vSphere 7, and we can say this now, in Tanzu, there will be perhaps new functionality to manage a virtual machine's lifecycle. And so right here, we might implement the selection of a virtual machine service based on the version of vSphere. So right now, that might be a Go vMommy package. Later, it might be another Kubernetes service, and we might want to rely on that, our Kubernetes controller. So again, this just sort of buries the some of the logic down into this new virtual machine service. And although it's not listed here, Yuvraj, actually, you know what? You've sent me that branch. Let me, I'm not sharing my desktop good. So I can actually show off your branch here a little bit. You sent this, it's gonna be up here. Yeah, it's a provider, oh, there it is, okay. Yeah, so he's done a little bit more work on it than that. That was just my placeholder. So you can actually see that what used to be in Go vMommy, now we have like reconcile network, reconcile provider ID, and that's because the virtual machine object that reconcile VM returns includes basic information about the virtual machine. Its name, its BIOS UUID, its instance UUID, its state, as well as its network status. And that way, when we're implementing the, another version of the virtual machine service, it doesn't have to worry about updating the machine status with the node addresses. It doesn't have to worry about updating the provider ID. We're handling all that inside of the controller. It just has to reconcile the VM with the intended state and then return a state view of the machine or the virtual machine. Any questions about that? Last big change is there's no longer a command directory. I think that we will be reintroducing it with something like cluster vSphere ADM. Although I think I have a branch called cluster VMW ADM, just because I don't like vSphere being so long in the command name, though it probably will be vSphere ADM. And that's because we no longer build cluster cuddle. That is going to be a command that is just built out of CAPI and released out of CAPI. Our getting started guide does reflect that. It will know how to do the pivot of resources based on the strategy we talked, one of the two strategies we discussed earlier. The manager binary is built out of the root of the project in main.go. And it's pretty basic. It looks very similar to our old manager. It just sets up the two controllers, as well as some additional stuff out from Kappa, like leader election, that I don't think was implemented by the time I copied this code. So I need to go in and reintroduce that. Although I did maintain some of the additional flags we added. Siddharth, I see you joined the call. Something that I did not or hasn't been maintained in V1 Alpha 2, and I'm going to reopen this issue so you can address it, is the maintenance mode. And the reason I haven't maintained it is because of the fact that I'm not sure the best way to maintain that now that we have these controllers. If you wanted to implement that in a different manner or using different, if you wanted to implement it differently in V1 Alpha 2. So if I'll open an issue for that, and then we can discuss, or you can open a PR. It was a fairly simple PR. I think it was like 1 or 2 lines in a couple of places. It should be even easier now because there's a single reconcile function. So let me see what's different. Open issue for maintenance mode. And for those people who aren't familiar, Siddharth had created a feature in V1 Alpha 1 that if you had a specific annotation on a machine, it would not be processed in any manner until that annotation was removed. But because there's so many different related resources now, I wasn't sure if the way we implemented it before is still valid. So.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll take a look with the newer version of the code and try and come up with what we can do with that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it might still be as simple as it was. I'm just not sure. So yeah, I would talk to Yuvraj because he's the one doing that. But like in this reconcile function, I mean, honestly, it may be as simple as right here. Once you have this machine, if it's got that annotation, you just return and requeue.
Right.
Like that may, because literally a single function for reconcile.
Yeah, yeah. I hope that is basically how we initially implemented it, which was like, as you said, like just a very
Yeah.
small change. Hopefully, it's going to be almost a similar size change, but we can basically reintroduce that feature here with the new code base.
My
I'll
only
definitely.
concern is because there's now multiple resources for a machine, the CAPI
Right.
resource and our resource. I
Mhm.
don't know if there's an expectation on how those two need to interact.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let me get up to speed with this because I'm not up to speed with the latest change that we're just getting merged right now. So let me get up to speed with that, and then we can talk more about like how we can do it.
Yeah,
Or
and
what
Yuvraj, Siddharth, I'll be happy to schedule another call with you and kind of review all this again, because you've got the deepest background of anyone on the call on this, myself included. So I definitely want to make sure you're up to speed on this. And by the way, this wasn't just because we were bored on one weekend. This was the V1 Alpha 2 work, and
Yeah.
obviously the direction that CAPI is going. So
No, I completely agree. I mean, I understand, but thanks a lot. I mean, I know I've been kind of out of action for like a couple of weeks because of other work priorities, but hopefully now I'll get some more time to devote
yep,
here. So
yep.
I'll try and catch up as quickly as possible.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. And so under examples, this is where our generate script is now for manifest for people wanting to play with that. It's going to look very similar. It's going to basically be the same. The difference is it actually reaches out to some remote repositories for building the CAPI and kubeadm components. I've looked into maybe building that into the image at the version of which the image is built, like looking in the Go mod file and saying, what's using this version of kubeadm, get those resources, just so that if we produce a manifest image, it doesn't need to actually talk to GitHub to do anything. But basically, I've tested this from the image and locally. It works really well. I can show you. Let me stop share and share my screen real quick. Way it looks. Just desktop. So be hacked. No, it's actually going to be examples. Examples generate. I don't know if I've got. Okay, so source and. Yep, and so it generates it before, and it notes that, hey, this includes vSphere credentials. I'm not going to open this provider components because it will indicate that it does, but I do want to point out that the credentials actually are no longer in the machine spec at all. The credentials get included as part of.
Well, the credentials were never in the machine spec, right? You mean cluster spec?
I meant cluster spec, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So the credentials are now included as this secret called Manager Bootstrap credentials for the Bootstrap cluster, and then they get added as, I want to say cluster, it's not cluster, it's provider components. Is it image patch? Not that. Oh, it's our manager.yaml. No, where is it? That's this, it's default. Yeah, here we go. They get added as a environment variable for the manager image, and I updated the cluster context for when it's getting those. It reads the environment variables for those, and this is probably not the best way to do it. AWS does it by including a credentials file on disk. We had this conversation, Andrew, last week. I honestly forget with who now about the way they did. I think it was the gap analysis, but the way they did security. And they said they actually would use a file on disk. It was preferable. So here, AWS does this. I had a conversation with Doug McAkron. For those who aren't aware, he's largely responsible for the Gobi Mummy project. So he said, we can absolutely look at doing something similar where it will look at a file on disk for credentials if we want to do that. And that would keep credentials out of any manifests in any capacity. They wouldn't be stored as a secret. They would just get loaded from disk like that if we wanted to do something like that. But yeah, so the nice thing is now it does keep the credentials out of plain sight, at least. They are stored as a secret and then mounted as environment variables for the manager for the bootstrapping. So they're no longer part of the cluster spec at all.
Hey, Andrew, quick question. I think this again. I'm sorry if
No,
I'm
go ahead. Don't
question.
apologize.
This secret here, you said that this is now included when you create the controller is referencing to that particular secret. Does that mean in the mode where example where you are deploying, where you have like a centralized management server where you are, or you have centralized Kubernetes cluster where you're deploying the CAPV and you're just deploying n number of clusters, can you not do multiple VCs? Let's say if you have like, you want to manage different environments, right? Let's say from a central location. So you deploy CAPV once, and now I want to spin up, a Kubernetes cluster in VC1, a different Kubernetes cluster in VC2. So I need to be able to, create these secrets and then refer them within the
Yeah,
purview.
so yeah, I hear what you're saying. So yeah, right now this credential is just for the bootstrap process.
Okay.
What you're talking about though is there are two ways the credentials interact with vSphere. There is, you might have multiple management CAPV management clusters, which is likely not going to be the case unless you want to do that, like you said, for credential reasons, and then in which case just give them different credentials. This does not necessarily reflect the same credentials that would be used for the cloud provider. The cloud provider can still specify whatever credentials it wants via different secrets.
No, but wouldn't this credential is what is used to actually spin off, for example, the VMs? I'm guessing that's what it is for, right? And
Yes, it is, but that's also the case before, right? The credentials that you would supply the initial cluster spec would have been what was used to spin up all future clusters. This just takes it out of the cluster spec, right? I mean,
right.
yeah.
But previously, for example, you could deploy, let's say, the CAPV controller on one. Let's say if you have a stable Kubernetes cluster, we just deploy CAPV controller, and then I could have created, let's say, in like two different namespaces. In one namespace, I create one cluster object in which I would have specified, here's the VC credentials. You can go to VC1 with these credentials and kind of spin off the complete cluster in there. In the second namespace, I could have created another cluster object with a different VC and the set of credentials where it could have actually gone in and actually deployed a cluster completely in different environment. But they all are basically being handled by the same
I see what you're saying.
controller.
I see what you're saying. So you're right. This does kind of make the credentials a singleton, so that it could be viewed as a regression. The other way I thought about doing this was implementing a secret on the actual cluster and not the cloud config. And honestly, you could do that today. And did I do that? I may have actually done that. I don't actually remember now. I know I thought about doing it. Did I actually do it? No, but I think originally I had this as like secret and secret namespace, much like there
Yeah,
is in the
right.
cloud config. So I think
That's
that makes sense. And it could just default to this value. So
perfect.
what I'll do is I'll add an issue so that it doesn't use environment variables. But although I'll create an issue and then we can discuss it there, because I'm actually not sure what the non-singleton I don't know why it's singleton approach for cluster provider creds. I don't know what the right approach is for the credentials. Like pulling it from the cluster like that seems odd to me. Like I would think it would, I would think it should be a singleton, but I see your point, because I mean, although that implies that the cluster spec is somehow part of the security boundary. See what I'm saying? I don't know that
Right.
that makes sense. Like I think making it a secret, and then so you know what I think we should do, honestly, is very similar to what the cloud provider has done, where you've got different vCenters that can have different
Yes.
credentials.
Yes.
I think that what we probably need to do, instead of having it under cluster, have this as part of the manager, so that the manager itself has some type of config, and
Right.
you can have basically a map of vCenters to credentials.
Right. I mean, one way I think of it is, let's say if you say that the controller, let's say you create a label, it can it can query, let's say, some secrets based on a label match, right? And all you do is basically you introduce multiple vCenters in the picture. All you do is create a number of secrets, label them appropriately so that the controller can take a note about it. right? So then
Yeah,
there'd be much more
absolutely.
dynamic behavior. And then essentially the only thing left is like wherever, either in the cluster spec or the machine spec, depending on like, there are two use cases. Like one is currently, I think today we only support one Kubernetes cluster spanning just one VC. But in any case, in the, let's say in the even a little bit longer future, if you were to go down the path where we can say, let's see if we can actually spin up one Kubernetes cluster which is spanning more than one VCs, if at all, if that is possible. I'm not saying that would, but if we go down that path sometime, any day, then we would need to essentially be able to associate, let's say, one cluster context with one or more VC credentials.
Yeah.
And we could
Well,
probably
not
do
if they're using
that.
SSO, but yeah, I hear you. Like,
Yeah,
we can create an issue for this. There's like
absolutely.
2 or 3 ways to solve this.
I agree.
I understand the problem now that we sort of regress to. Although, as I understand it better, I feel like the previous solution was more a side effect, and I actually don't like the way that we basically used a cluster object or resource to store multiple credentials. Like that shouldn't be part of the cluster resource.
I agree. I mean, I completely like the way that it is now, that you have to have security. I mean, I know we've talked earlier in as well,
Yeah.
that the credentials should not be part of any spec directly. At best, it should be just either a reference or there's some indirect connection that should establish like what credentials to use. But it definitely should not be stored within the. I completely agree with that. Yeah, let's maybe discuss a little bit more and on the issue that you can open, and we
Yep.
can weigh in different pros and cons of various methods, and we can go from there.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Thank you. And just before we end the call, I don't think there's anything too different here in how we make anything. We no longer use the controller gen tools. KubeBuilder 2 is used to generate the CRDs as well as the defaults. I don't know if like that's new for a lot of people. KubeBuilder book, but in KubeBuilder now, it controls things like deep copy, if you're not familiar with that. There's like a fun side effect to that. I actually had to disable KubeBuilder on these functions because it was failing. So I can't generate deep copy for functions. Well, then why are you trying? But yeah, so this is all based on KubeBuilder v2, customized v3, and KubeBuilder has a nice side effect that it generates non-compliant code. It does not generate code that satisfies Go format. So there is a hidden call here. So as soon as it's generated, it formats it. So we actually are modifying generated code. As long as you generate it with this target, you're fine. And we no longer need shell with Go path, Andrew. That's completely gone because everything is now fully Go modules compliant. And again, cluster cuddle is gone. So yeah, everything's a little bit simpler. Oh, and if y'all didn't see this, I kind of tweeted about it because of everything we kind of removed. We have 100% across the board right now on our Go report card. So I actually am thinking of adding some checks for things like Go Cyclo and spelling because I don't want a PR to come in and kill this. It's actually pretty cool that we're at 100%. So yeah, we're doing pretty well with, keep making sure everything's kind of up to date with standards and all that good stuff. That's all I've got. If anyone's got any other questions, now would be a great time. All right. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's worked so hard on this to get it to V1 Alpha 2. It's a weird state. I wasn't real comfortable like driving master to that when it's a non-working thing, but others are doing it. They want us to do it, and hopefully we won't live in this weird V1 Alpha 1, V1 Alpha 2 state for too long. I'm going to do what I can to get us to where V1 Alpha 2 is working. Jim, for you, the images should work for both eventually. And Andrew, that's actually something we should probably make sure we check with Jim on before we start building images based on the new image builder repo. I built the images for Jim based on our old process because once we switch to the new one, it's no longer going to support V1 Alpha 1. Because V1 Alpha 1 uses that kubeadm module that is getting stripped out of the new Cloud init.
Do we need to support like V1A1 and V1A2 images separately? Like, do we need to start versioning but do we need to add the cluster API version to the images now?
So I raised that issue. I actually have a, where is this? I actually was not going to work on this, but I forgot why I created this issue in the first place. And now I'm thinking we should. I think I closed this and I think we should reopen it. Yeah. Let me reopen this. This is the only reason that those images built on the new process would be invalid for V1A1. If we switch to run commands, then the new images would work for V1A1 as well. And it wouldn't be an overly large amount of work. It just would require some testing, but at least it would allow us to build images that work for both versions. Although I think I created an issue for this in the image builder, because as I pointed out to Jason in the image builder repo, right now everybody just versions based on the Kubernetes version. But I pointed out this cloud init issue to him as well. And his response was, well, they'll just point people to different issues. I said, for us, it's a little bit different because they have to actually import these templates, and it's not just as easy as saying, here's an AMI ID. It would be ideal if our images could support both.
Yeah.
And so if we make this change to V1A1, they could.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also concerned around like breaking compatibilities in the images without knowing, right? Like if you downloaded an image from like 3 months ago, and then we made a bunch of changes, uploaded new images or whatever, and then
Oh, no, absolutely. That's why I didn't do that. Like until we do that, we can't make breaking changes to the images.
Yep.
That's why I use the old version. But if at least this, so probably two things we need to track. We should probably do this for forward compatibility from V1A1, or backward compatibility rather, from the new images. And then we should create an issue in the KubeADM image builder to add the image build version, not just the Kubernetes version. Machine images should be versioned on the image builder, not just the K8's version. Yeah, or the API version, whatever, as long as that lines up. Yeah, all right. All right, everyone, thanks for the time. Does anyone have any other questions?
No, just thank you for all the effort. I mean, I know it's a lot of moved in the repository. So.
Nah, Yuvraj is doing all the hard work. I just get to tell him what to do, and he's leaving in a couple of weeks, so I'm kind of really frustrated. I'm gonna have to actually go back to doing stuff. Thanks, everyone. Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.